Okay, welcome back. In this video, would like to go over the formation of the perfect subjunctive, the pluperfect subjunctive, and the subjunctive of irregular verbs. So we're gonna just talk through a few different examples and exactly how to form these. Hopefully, eliminate any questions that you all had as you're approaching this material. I know that it's quite a bit to learn all up front, but don't worry. We're going to spend a good bit of time on this week and next, so you'll be pretty comfortable with the subjunctive by the end of it. So yeah, let's just start off real quick with. I'd like to just emphasize a bit of symmetry that I haven't mentioned quite yet, but I'm just going to draw a little table here as best I can. And this will be the subjunctive table. Um, so So far what we went over is the present and the imperfect. And what we're going to be adding to this list is perfect and pluperfect. And what I think is most important for you to realize here is the present and the imperfect function in symmetry with the perfect and the pluperfect. They're very similar in many ways, especially both with how they're formed and even in the ways that they are used. We won't quite get to exactly some of those distinctions, but just the idea in general is important to recognize and will hopefully help you understand them in the future better as well. But if you're curious, this idea is called the sequence of tenses. So I don't want to spend too much longer on this idea, but I want to sort of introduce you to the idea that the present and the imperfect function together in a similar way. They're both based on the present stem, and the perfect and the pluperfect also function similarly, and they're both formed off of the perfect stem. All right, so now that we've talked a little bit about that, let's talk about how exactly to form the perfect active subjunctive and the perfect passive. So this subjunctive form is fairly as simple as the other ones. There really isn't too much that's complicated on forming the subjunctive. It just takes sort of a fairly good hold on previous ideas and then sort of jumbling around things a little bit to make them work. But essentially the algorithm or the way that we do this is similar. We take our perfect active stem, which is essentially the third principal part without the ending, amao, and then we add our ending to it, our little modifier, which is eri. This is the subjunctive modifier for the perfect. And then what we do is we just add our personal endings to the end of it. So it could be any of those. And that is essentially how it works for the perfect active. But something I'd like to just make sure you're aware of, so you don't get too frustrated learning this, is that this is actually, in almost every way, identical to the future perfect active tense, the future perfect. In other words, so ama wero, ama weris, just to remind you, erit. So arrow. So essentially, it is arrow eris, the future of sum. The only difference here is we just have this arif form stays consistent the entire time, and we add an m to the end of it instead of a long o. Another thing that you might note that is also a bit different is the vowel. The length of the vowel of these forms is also a long I instead of a short I for those future perfect forms. But otherwise, it is a very, very consistently similar form. So as far as the active goes, it works quite similarly for the other conjugations as well. So capi, I just use capio again, but we take our perfect active stem, we add era to the end, and then we add our personal endings. So exact same as before. So the perfect passive subjunctive is also not too complicated, but it's also important just to go over, just to make sure we're aware of what's going on. But essentially, it is quite similar to our perfect passive indicative. Spelled it wrong again. Indicative. We just, instead of using the indicative form of sum, so sum est, we use the subjunctive form. And I have a slide going over these forms at the end of this video as well. But it doesn't hurt to get associated with them now. So sim, cis, sit, simus, situs, sint. But otherwise, the perfect passive subjunctive is formed exactly the same as our perfect passive indicative. Namely, the perfect passive stem, or the fourth principal part, is essentially an adjective or a periphrastic tense with its subject. So an example of the indicative form is the poet was loved. So we'll just keep it simple. The poet was loved. So just to highlight this, the perfect passive participle here is essentially an adjective or a predicate adjective that's modifying our subject here. But this is how we form our perfect passive tense. So it's essentially the same thing. The only thing you would change for this is sit. So poeta amata sit. All right. So the next, and it also works the exact same way for our other conjugations. We just use our fourth principal part and then use the subjunctive of sum, the present subjunctive of sum. So yeah, let's take a look at the pluperfect subjunctive. And it is quite similar. Not too much different going on with this one, but it's also important to take a look at it. So, but what I'd like to highlight here is the fact that the perfect active infinitive is what's used. And recall that our pluperfect is parallel to our imperfect subjunctive as well. And our imperfect subjunctive is formed off of the present active infinitive. So there's a bit of symmetry there. So our imperfect is present, but our pluperfect is the perfect active infinitive. So an example of this is amawasa. So that is to have loved, amawasa. And then essentially it follows the exact same game. We just stick our personal endings on the end there. And we occasionally have the vowel lengthening. And that's actually similar to how our imperfect subjunctive worked as well. The ending of the infinitive, the vowel ending, was actually also lengthened as well. So that's also consistent with our third conjugation. Capise is the perfect active infinitive. And all you do is you stick the personal ending onto the end there. So, and the passive infinitive is also quite easy. It's the pluperfect subjunctive passive, just to give the whole title there. It's quite symmetrical to the perfect passive subjunctive as well. So I'm just going to go back real quick. So remember that our perfect passive subjunctive was formed with fourth principal part and the present of sum. The pluperfect is formed with the imperfect of sum. but it still uses the same fourth principle part. And I'll go over this in just a second in the next slide, but the imperfect of assume is quite simple to form as well. The only trick is, and it actually follows the exact same rules that we've seen. It is the infinitive, so it's the, like I said, it's the imperfect. So it forms off of the infinitive of the verb, and then all you do is you add your endings to it. So SM, SA, set. So very, very consistent, very, very similar. And this is essentially how it works for most of our tenses of the subjunctive. So we've seen 4 different examples: the present, the imperfect, the perfect, and the pluperfect. Now in this last slide, I just want to go over some of the irregular verbs that you might see. I've only written sum into our table just to give you the full example of it, but there are a couple others that might be a bit strange that you want to review in the textbook as well. If you follow it, but essentially my advice for you, and what I would recommend doing, is learn the subjunctive of sum in the present, imperfect, perfect, and pluperfect. And then for some of our various other forms like possum, wolo, nolo, and malo, that are a bit different, they follow a very similar pattern to sum. So if you look at them closely, you'll notice that they are quite consistent. So, but before we end this video, I just want to go over these forms just to give you an idea of what you're looking at. So sum is a bit different from its normal indicative form, present indicative form. But if you notice, a few of the forms do actually make a certain amount of sense if you think about them. But we're not going to spend too much time on how exactly they got this way. But it is just important to note some of the differences. So some things that I noticed were this I is consistent throughout every form. In some situations, the I is long, and in some it's short, depending on the ending. But it's very consistent. We also have the exact same set of endings: MST, mustisent, the exact same present active subjunctive endings we've seen so far. So that it's not necessarily anything new you're learning there either. And then in our next, our imperfect subjunctive, we have, similarly to how we were in our last slide, we just take our infinitive of sum, which is esse, and then we stick our subjunctive active endings on there. And it's also important to note there is no passive subjunctive for sum. It's all active. So that's one thing less you have to learn necessarily for this. And then it's very similar for our perfect subjunctive. If you'll recall, our perfect subjunctive for sum is fui. It has this, it's formed off of a different root, but it's still the same verb. It just uses fui instead. Similar to how the future participle is as well, futurus. But it uses this form, and similar to our other perfect active subjunctives, you just use the stem, which doesn't include the long I ending for the first person perfect active indicative, and you just stick this erim, eris, erit onto the end of it. So also quite simple. And then finally, our pluperfect subjunctive is also relatively straightforward as well. We use the perfect active infinitive, which is similarly formed off of our perfect active stem, which is just fu. And then you add this issa ending to it. And then to the end of that, all you do is you just add your personal endings. So MST, MS fuesatus fuesent. So yeah, that's essentially the forms of sum. A couple other things I'd just like to note is AO is a form that might be potentially confusing, but something that is helpful for me to note the similarity in is the present subjunctive actually looks a lot like the second conjugation subjunctive forms. So moneo, for example, moneam, moneas. The only thing that you do is it's essentially just that eam, eos form. You just chop off the actual verbal part, and the present subjunctive, that should be long right there, is just that ending itself. So hopefully that's helpful for learning that pattern as well. Otherwise, theo and pharaoh, two of our other irregular verbs, form very similarly to the other third conjugation verbs. So yeah, so I think I'll end it there. If you have any questions, or if you'd like anything else, me to clear up anything else, just feel free to let me know. In the next video, I will be talking a bit more about how to translate the subjunctive in independent clauses. So, all right, thank you. Have a good day.